As my cats demonstrate, sometimes learning involves a bit of wrestling. One of the key tensions that surfaced in many of your podcast interviews was the push and pull between medical explanations of disability and broader social or systemic ways of interpreting people's experiences. I want to take a few minutes to talk about some patterns I noticed across the podcast interview assignments. Overall, I really appreciated the effort that many of you put into these. Interviewing someone about their experiences with learning, disability, or education can be uncomfortable and unpredictable, and many of you took that risk seriously. You approached people thoughtfully and asked meaningful questions, and in many cases created podcasts that were engaging and polished. But the purpose of this assignment was not simply to produce a polished podcast. The goal was to produce interpretation, to think critically about the experiences you might have heard in relation to the concepts we are exploring in this course. So I want to take a few minutes about the common themes that I noticed. First pattern I saw was that many interviews framed challenges primarily through a mental health lens. Students talked about stress, anxiety, burnout, or emotional strain in school settings. These are very real experiences and they absolutely matter. However, in many cases, the discussion stopped there. The experiences were described as personal struggles rather than being interpreted through the broader social, institutional, or disability frameworks. One of the core ideas in this course is that difficulties in learning or participation are not only located in individuals, they also emerge through systems, expectations, and structures. When we look in an experience through a critical disability lens, we start asking different questions. Instead of asking, what is wrong with the student or how can they cope better, we ask questions like, expectations does the system create about what a normal learner should look like? Who benefits from these expectations? And who gets left outside of them? Interviews contained really interesting experiences that could have opened the doors to these kinds of questions, but the interpretation stayed mostly descriptive. The difference between description and interpretation is important. Description tells us what happened. Interpretation tells us what it might mean and what larger structures it connects to. Some podcasts were very professionally produced. The audio was smooth, the conversation flowed well, and the editing was impressive. But sometimes the conceptual engagement with the course material was quite light. At the same time, some podcasts that were lightly or less polished technically actually demonstrated deeper thinking. In those cases, students were clearly trying to wrestle with the tensions in the readings and connect them with the experiences that they were hearing. So this is an important lesson going forward. Strong presentation is great, but in graduate work, the most important thing is the quality of the thinking behind it. Another pattern involved perspective taking. Some interviews stayed very close to the students' own assumptions about school or disability. In stronger submissions, students used the interview as an opportunity to step outside their own perspective and really listen to the experiences of others. They asked questions about contexts, systems, and environments. They allowed the conversation to challenge what they thought they already knew. Ideally, by the end of the course, you might find yourself becoming more suspicious of diagnostic certainty, more attuned to tombs of forms of distress that are often invisible in schools, more cautious about mistaking compliance for well-being, and more reflective about the power you hold as educators or professionals in education systems. These are not easy shifts to make. They require practice. They require questioning assumptions that are often deeply embedded in educational institutions. The assignment was one opportunity to start practicing that kind of thinking. And like all learning processes, it's not about getting everything perfect the first time. It's about developing the habit of asking deeper questions. So as we move forward in the course, I encourage you to keep pushing beyond description. Try to connect experiences to structures. Look for tensions. Ask what might be visible in stories we hear. This is where the most interesting insights tend to emerge. I also want to take a moment to talk about the following assignment instructions and asking questions when something is unclear. A few of the submissions were thoughtful and clearly involved a lot of effort, but they did not fully follow the instructions or expectations outlined in the assignment. In graduate work, precision matters. If something in the instructions feels unclear, it's always better to ask a question rather than make assumptions about what the assignment is asking for. Assignments like this are designed very intentionally. The goal is not simply to complete a task, but to practice a particular kind of thinking or analysis. When the structure changes too much, it can make it harder to assess the learning goals of the assignment was meant to support. It is also important to understand that this assignment was designed as an applied stepping stone towards your final annotated bibliography and reflection. The podcast interview was an opportunity to practice identifying meaningful tensions, connecting lived experience to course concepts, and moving beyond description towards interpretation. Another important point is that interviews are not neutral pieces of data. They are conversations shaped by who's asking the questions, what assumptions are already present, and what the interviewee feels comfortable sharing. Part of the analytical work is reflecting on how those dynamics shape the stories we hear. Even if your podcast did not fully reach the level of interpretation you were hoping for, the conversation you had is still valuable. As you move towards the final assignment, you might find it helpful to revisit that interview and think about what additional questions or interpretations you see now after working through more of the course material. Some of the most interesting submissions were the ones where students took intellectual risks, even if everything was not perfectly resolved. Graduate work is not about having the right answer. It's about being willing to explore tensions and sit with complex ideas. The more you deeply engage with the readings in this course, the easier it will become to move from description to interpretation. The readings are not just background material, they are the tools to help you see the patterns and tensions and the experiences people describe.